We are in a bit of a pickle. We have got 3 classes, and I'll just use this one to be fine. We got 3 classes left and 3 chapters left, and we just spent a month in Hebrews 10. So our pace is going to have to speed up a little bit. If we don't get through chapter 13, we may do that like on a Sunday morning and Sunday night later on. But we're going to finish up chapter 10. There was just a couple of verses left there, and then we're going to get in and spend some time in chapter 11, which I know is probably the chapter in Hebrews that we're most familiar with. But we left off last week in verse 32, and we sort of left off in discussion in 31 with that statement, it's a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And we spent some time talking about that and the seriousness of that statement. But then in 32, the writer's going to call to remembrance some previous experiences. He says, remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you had endured a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. And so he's talking about here some public form of persecution. And so we talked about a little bit last week that in the Roman Empire, you could maintain your religion as long as it was a religion that was accepted by the Roman government, which Judaism was. But when these people converted to Christianity, Christianity was not. There were a ton of baseless claims that were made against Christians, and we've discussed those in detail before. And so those people had their property taken away. They were abused. They were publicly persecuted. And that word for publicly exposed there is a word that has to do with being out in the theater. And so there seems to be some reference, and that word is used in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9. It says, for it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena. So it seems he's making reference there to public, not only insult, not only humiliation, but public sacrifice, right? We remember the stories of those that were sacrificed to the lions in the Colosseum. And so he's using that same sort of language. He says, you were just like those people. You were taken advantage of in the midst of the persecution. You were publicly exposed. You had your property taken away. You had all these things going on in your life. And he says, remember those things. So why do you think for people that are on the edge of apostasy, people that are thinking about walking away from the church and back to a more comfortable religion, why would he bring to remembrance all those difficult times that they'd had in the past? That seems like a little bit of a backwards way of trying to inspire people, doesn't it? So why do you think he does that?
I think he tries to get us lined up for what's coming. I mean, we're crazy. We're persecuted, looked down on, and talked about, throughout life. Way back then, I'm sure way on in the future.
Yeah, so he's preparing them for future persecution. That's certainly got to be part of it. What else do you think? Let me just throw this out there, especially for some of you married couples. How many of you married couples were really poor when you first got married? How many of you are really poor now? Raise your hand. I can remember my mom telling me all the time about when her and my dad got married, and they lived in rough conditions, and one time they didn't even have a telephone, and all this stuff, and I think about, how difficult that was. But almost universally, if you're to talk to people that have been married 25 or 30 years and who are doing well, and they've got these nice homes and nice automobiles and all the things that we would sort of strive to, almost universally, those couples would tell you that their fondest memories come from those early days when they were struggling to make it, when they were young and in love and didn't care about money. And do you find that to be true in your own lives and your own experiences, that you can sort of look back on tough times fondly and just think about how good life was then?
Well, we look back on youth.
Okay, you look back on youth in a lot of ways.
We were young.
Yeah, right, you were young.
I don't think we worried as much about, I'm sure a lot of people have been this way. You have so much money, you go to the grocery store and you total it up as you buy. When you run out of money, you quit buying.
Right.
But you didn't, I never felt deprived or anything like that.
Yeah, there was less to worry about, you know, and I think that's true. And as you get older, you know, there's an expression that some of you may be familiar with, more money, more problems, right? So the more responsibilities that we have and we start worrying about all these things that we have to deal with and, you know, 401ks and IRAs and all these other things. And, you know, that sometimes we look back on those times and go, man, you know, that was great. Even though it was a struggle, right? Even though it was hard, even though it was difficult. Yeah, I think that same psychology or that same nostalgia is at play in these scriptures here. Because he says, do you remember in those days when you first had that faith and you were able to taste and feel what it was like to have the genuine article, to have the real thing, to get up every day and know that you were fighting for something, for a cause. And he says, now you know, things have gotten a little bit easier, and so you're in danger of slipping back into it. He says, remember when you had that fire and that passion in your gut for the faith. And I think he's calling that to remembrance. What do you think? It almost seems counterintuitive to talk about negative times to get you to want to do things better, but it does.
Maybe he's reminded him that it was worth suffering for back then, just ain't worth living for now.
Yeah, absolutely. Why would you go through all that just to slip right back to where you were before that? You know, for me, I'll never forget when, you know, being a part of a small church, and every time you had a visitor, you know, it was celebrated. Every time there was a new member, that there was that, you know, just sort of victorious feeling. And now, you know, we're here and we're a little bit bigger congregation, and maybe we take those things for granted, and we don't put as much into it as if we were a small congregation sort of struggling with every member. And so I think that struggle after it's over brings back nostalgia. Hard work brings nostalgia for us, right? You know, the hardest day's work you've ever been a part of, just think about it for a minute, whatever it might have been, if it's in a hay field or digging a ditch or digging up a septic tank or whatever it might have been, you know, and oh man, it was just tough. But then when you look back on it and you see what you accomplished, you sort of feel that sense of pride. I think it's this same thing that's at play, and I think that can be a powerful motivator if it's employed the right way. And listen to what he says in verse 35, and this goes to David's point that he made a minute ago. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. He says the struggle is going to be worth it. Verse 36, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. Anybody know where those quotations come from? Somebody said it, I thought. In the book of the Old Testament. Habakkuk chapter 2, absolutely. In verse 39, he closes out this thought, but we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. So he says, we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed. That's not our legacy, right? That's not our heritage. That's not who we're a part of. Those people that fall back into apostasy, that's not who we are. He says, we are part of those who have faith and are saved. And what's that going to lead us into at the beginning of the next thought? What comes next?
Faith.
Right, faith, the hall of faith. Now, I want to go back and touch on something that we just touched on for a minute. Verse 34. So I'm reading out of the NIV tonight. This just happened to be what I have pulled up. But in several translations, it says, you suffered with me in chains. Anybody's translation say that? You suffered with me in chains? Okay. Had passion on me in chains. Is that New King James? Okay. Anybody else say anything? So there's a thought by a lot of people who read that who say, well, look, you know, there it is. That had to be Paul that wrote it because Paul says, you suffered with me in my chains. And where else does Paul say that? Where else do we hear about Paul in chains? 2 Timothy writes about it. Where else? Philippians, you know, all those letters that are the, quote, prison epistles. So when somebody hears that phrase, in chains, of course it has to be saying that, well, Paul wrote that. But actually, the better translation is here, you suffered along with those in prison. So it's talking about anybody generally who was sent to prison and suffering for their faith. So that there really is no vague reference to the author. It's more talking about all those people who went through the suffering and the faith. So it's really not necessarily the strong indicator that some would have us to believe that Paul could be the author. Because as we've said, if Paul was the author, he probably would have introduced himself at the outset of the letter. All right, any other thoughts on 10? I know we spent several weeks here, but we've got to move on. Final thoughts about chapter 10. Not everybody at once. All right, good. Let's move into 11 now and spend the rest of our time here this evening. Somebody read Hebrews 11:1. Read the New King James for us, if you don't mind, Ms. Judy.
Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Okay, the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. The NIV here says, faith is the confidence that we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That word confidence there, or assurance in the New King James, I believe it is actually used 3 times in the book of Hebrews. And guess what? It's translated 3 different ways based on the context. And so that's sort of a slippery word that we fall into in the Greek. But it says, so faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What about some of your other versions? How do they define it? What does the easy to read say? Where's John?
Conviction of things not seen.
Say that one more time.
Conviction of things not
The
seen.
conviction of things not seen. I like that. John, what does the easy to read say? Oh, he's pulling it up. Okay. What about the New American Standard, Mark?
That's what mine
Conviction.
is.
That's what you have as well. Anybody else using a crazy version that you don't want to admit in Bible class?
Revised Standard says conviction.
Revised Standard says conviction. RSV is a great version. I was looking at this table the other day. I was in an argument with a very stubborn person who's sitting in this room about Bible translations. I won't mention their name, John Painter. But and we were talking about all the different versions that are out there. And so it's interesting. The ESV is now the most popular version in the world, which is sort of strange. And the other versions are falling. The NIV and the New King James, those are becoming the quote older versions, but the RSV still has a very strong following. For years and years, the RSV was the standard for those that didn't want to use the original King James but still wanted to be sound in the brotherhood. The RSV was used. The original American Standard was very popular as a word-for-word translation, and it was replaced by the New American Standard. So it's interesting to see how people are looking at the different translations. And of course, we have to sort of pick and choose with each passage which is the best translation. What does the easy to read say?
It says, it is proof of what we cannot see.
Okay, it's proof of what we do not see. And so this for years and years has always been described as the definition of faith. It's been presented as this comprehensive understanding of what faith is. Is that what's at play here in Hebrews 11:1? Is this supposed to be our complete and total comprehensive understanding of what faith means? Of course not. Volumes could be written about the definition of faith, right? And the word that's used in Greek is used throughout the Bible over and over in different situations and in different contexts. And, we could spend just weeks and weeks talking about the definition of faith. What I think this is talking about, though, is describing faith for those that are in peril of losing it. So this is the concise definition of why it's important to have faith. Because faith gives us a confidence and assurance, a confident expectation, if you will, of things that we can't visibly see. It's almost like if you were to take a person who was an atheist or an agnostic and you were to start studying the Bible with them. You wouldn't get into a deep theological discussion about faith. You would say, here's what faith is. Faith is being able to have confidence in something you can't see. You would start with that simple, concise definition of what faith is. And I think that's what we have going on here in Hebrews 11:1. So I hope we don't sort of stress ourselves out by saying, oh, well, this is, we've got to dig into every little piece of this and see exactly what it means. Because I think this is supposed to be a reminder of what faith is for those that are in struggle. What do you think? I know that all of you have been studying this verse for your whole lives throughout lessons. What does that verse mean to you in Hebrews 11:1? And if somebody doesn't say anything, I'm not saying anything else the rest of the time.
Well, to me, we've always looked at it as the definition of faith. I mean, that's what we've always said, that belief that we have is the evidence that we need. We don't need anything that we can hold, and
Yeah, and that is a very popular theory. There's a philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard who's very, very well known in the philosophical world, and that's sort of what he espoused, because philosophers, for so long have been looking for what is this proof of God, and Kierkegaard would say that faith that resides within the human being, that's enough. You don't have to have anything tangible that belief within your heart that was innately put there by a creator would be enough. And I think in certain circumstances it has to be. But if you're like me and you're at heart a skeptic, you want to see those tangible things, don't you? You want to see those archaeological proofs, and you want to see where the Bible has been proven right over and over again, and you want to know that what you believe in, where you've set your path for eternity, you want to know that it's truthful, right? And so, I don't think it's wrong to desire a more elaborate definition, but we've always heard that. What else?
Jeremy?
Yes.
I remember, I think Jesus was talking, and I think he was talking to Thomas. I'm not positive. He was talking to maybe one of the apostles. I might have been Thomas. But he made the comment himself that he says, talking about them believing in him. He said he wanted, he's glad they believed in him because he was there for proof. But he hoped that people that hasn't seen him would believe.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I believe that's John
Right.
chapter 20. John 20, where Thomas, says, I need to stick my fingers in your wounds and feel that. And Jesus says, so much more blessed will they be that have believed without seeing. Yeah, there's certainly that element to it. Anything else on Hebrews 11:1?
Well, my Bible has a reference to Romans 8:24 and 25, which says, for we were saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, then we eagerly wait for it with perseverance.
Yeah, and that is an interesting thought. So once I've seen that hope, and we talked about the biblical definition of hope is confident expectation. We don't have to have hope in something we've seen, right? I hope that Brent Parker comes to church tonight. I don't have to hope because there he sits, right? And so hope, once it's realized, is not hope anymore. And so I think that's an interesting thought there in Romans 8. Verse 2, and if you have more comments, just interrupt as we go. It says, this is what the ancients were commanded for. Some versions will say elders. The word in Greek there is presbyteroi, which is one of our words translated elders. But he said that the ancients, those people of old, they were commended because they had hope in things that they could not see. So remember, at the end of chapter 10, he started leading them into a lineage of faith, right? He said, we don't belong to those people who were skeptics. We belong to people of faith, right? And so he says that's what those people that we belong to, that heritage, that lineage, that's what they were commended for. And he says there, and I think that verse 3, it hooks back into verse 1. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Creation is an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? Because if you've ever seen anything built or made, it takes a process, right? If somebody says to you they're going to go build a house, you expect them to start with a foundation and put a frame up and build from piece to piece. Somebody says to you they're going to plant some flowers or some vegetation. Well, you can see the process and you can see the ground, and you can see the planting, you can see the growth over time, and you can sort of see that. But when God created the world, He spoke it into existence. Can you imagine that it was dark and then it was light? And there was nothing and then there was something. If there was water and then there was land, right? And then there was no animals, and then there were animals. And there were no people, and then there were people. And God created the world and spoke it into existence. And so it's not when we look at creation, it's not that we can see God in the process of creation, that we can see Him building, and we can see Him planting, and we can see Him breathing life into the nostrils of human beings, but we see the results. And that's what our faith is in, that God was the creator of the world, not that we saw and helped Him and guided with Him through the process, but that we see the result, that the universe was formed at God's command, so that it was not the visible processes that were seen, but it was the finished result that is seen every single day. So our faith, while not based on tangible things like we're talking about, we certainly can see the tangible things. Turn your Bibles to Romans 1 really quick. This is always the passage that comes to my mind when we think about this. Starting down, I believe, in about verse 20. Romans 1 verse 20, for since the creation of the world, this is from the New King James, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. So those things that are invisible are seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. So Romans 1 and Hebrews 11 are almost the inverse of each other. You see what it's saying there? That there were people who, even though they laid their eyes and saw things, they rejected God. But here, the opposite of that, the inverse, is us. And even though we can't necessarily see the things, we have faith. And so these things sort of flip back and forth. And so he's reminding us about faith. And he's given us that concise definition. And he's going to talk about our lineage. And he talks about having faith in the creation. And then verse 4 starts what is perhaps one of the most talked about and discussed passages in all the Bible. This hall of faith, or the faith hall of fame. And we're going to go through these pretty quickly, and we'll sort of talk about each character in a little bitty narrative, and then we'll move on.
Jeremy?
Yes, ma'am.
Going further.
Sure.
Verse 3 is a great verse for teaching children to stop and think about who God really is. You ask them to plan to design something, which is what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And then, after they've drawn the picture of what they want to create, then you ask them, how are they going to make it? Well, their concept is only what they know. And so they're going to take plastic, or they're going to take wood, or they're going to take string. And then you ask them, where did God shop to get his supplies? And it causes them to stop and think. And it helps to start the seed of having faith in a creator that they really don't know and understand and can't see.
Yeah.
But this verse helps them understand.
Yeah, and it is sort of a humbling verse too, right? Because it's talking about ways. I have to admit to you, we switched the way that we watch TV at our house. We have this thing called YouTube TV, and Carla used to have all the cooking channels, Food Network, and they're not on this. And I'm kind of thankful, because there would be hours and hours on TV of people cooking all this delicious food, and before I know it, I'm starving to death, right? But the thing that aggravates me about those cooking shows, and when we were home this weekend at her parents', she was watching one with, she used to be a country singer. Yeah, Trisha Yearwood. And she would say, all right, and she made filet mignon chili. And I thought, if that's not the craziest thing, we eat chili when we're broke. We don't put filet mignon in it, right? But she made it. And so, she talked about the chili, and she said, here's all the ingredients. And then she walked over to the thing, and there it was, already completely cooked. Well, I need to know, step by step, and they stick their little fingers in there, and they grab it, and well, how much is that? It's a pinch. Well, what's a pinch? That's frustrating, because I have to have step by step and the exact measurements and the exact time, but they don't do that, right? And so it's almost an art form that's beyond our comprehension. And it's that same thing that well, how did they do that? Well, it's not for us to understand because we don't need to know how God did it. We need to know that he was powerful enough to speak it into existence. And so that is a great lesson. Any other thoughts on those first introductory verses? Okay, so let's jump into our Hall of Fame here. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. And by faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. We know the narrative of Cain and Abel, don't we? If you remember during our Teaching Rocket seminar, the Bible actually tells us how Abel was murdered. Doesn't anybody remember? Somebody said it. You gotta say it louder.
Horribly.
Horribly. The Bible actually says he was slaughtered, doesn't it? And so, it says that he went through it because he gave God a better offering. And what's always stood out to me about this, and we know the narrative, and I don't want to dismiss it, but it's a story that we all know. This idea that by faith, because of his faith, Abel, even though he's dead, still speaks. We live in a crazy world of technology, but we haven't figured out how to bring people back from the dead yet. I know a few years ago they put a hologram Michael Jackson on a stage and let it perform, but that's not really the same thing, is it? But imagine being able to hear somebody that's passed away. For a long time after my grandfather died, my mom kept a voicemail on her phone that he had left. When she's having a tough day, she would go and listen to that voicemail just to hear his voice. And we talked about grief earlier. I think those of us that have lost loved ones would appreciate the value of that. But this says Abel, even though he's still dead, his faith speaks for it. It's powerful. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken from this life. What is the phrase that we always remember that goes along with Enoch? Enoch did what?
Not see death.
He walked with God, right? He walked with God. Enoch, one of two people in the Old Testament that we read about that didn't die. Anybody remember who the other one was? Okay, Elijah, absolutely right. He did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. And before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And then verse 6, in the middle of this narrative, and this is very Paul-like, in the middle of this narrative, he just drops this sort of theological bomb on us, right? Verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. I believe the New King James says he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So he's in the middle of this narrative about all these people, and then he drops this, which is a huge verse. That to have a right relationship with God, we've got to have the right kind of faith. And that if we want to come to God, we have to have that faith and understand that there's a reward for that faith. And so it's always been fascinating to me that he sort of just sticks that in there. He keeps going in verse 7, by faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, remember that's a recall of verse 1, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. How about that expression that by his faith he condemned the world? What in the world does that mean? That by his faith Noah condemned the world.
He built an ark, so they were saved and the rest weren't.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm deaf. Oh, you're reading what you're saying. I have a struggle with this. So if we're of this lineage, does our faith condemn other people? I want you to really think about that. That's an important theme in this passage, I think. But by his faith, Noah condemned. Now we've talked here already about Abel. We've talked about Enoch. Now we're talking about Noah, one of the most famous characters in the Bible. And we're talking about how great it was, and he had this ark and everything wonderful. And then he drops that his faith condemned the world. Does that apply to us, or was that simply for Noah?
His faith caused him to build the ark, but it also caused him to try to teach those around him about God, and their rejection of God condemned them.
Yeah, absolutely. It says, we read other places in 1 Peter that Noah was a preacher of righteousness, that he preached all this time and nobody believed. But now let's bring this back to us now. Are we doing the same thing? There have been all these parallels made to us in Noah. 1 Peter 3, just as the world, that water destroyed sin in the time of Noah, so water destroys sin now. And if we want to have our sin destroyed, we have to participate in the act of baptism. Does our baptism and our faith and our commitment, does that condemn other people?
If we're teaching, yeah.
Absolutely it does. There should be no hesitation in that. If I'm saying that I believe in what has been proclaimed in the Bible to be the only way to be saved, then my admission of that faith does cause condemnation to those that don't believe. And we've got to be willing to say that with conviction, Bob.
Salvation comes only through obedience to God's commands to us, and He commands that we obey Him and follow Him. And those who did were rewarded, as is being described here. Those who didn't perished. That's what this Hall of Fame is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so even if we're, none of us would ever say, oh, now I'm a Christian, all of you are condemned. We wouldn't use that language, but essentially what we're saying is that if I agree with the statement that there's only one way to heaven, and that's through Jesus Christ, John 14:6, and if I'm taking that route, then I'm saying everybody else who doesn't is condemned, and that's something we have to be willing to do. I saw a hand somewhere, Brent.
Let's back up a little bit on that verse 6. And without faith, it is impossible to please Him. So that means without faith, there's nothing you can do that's going to make God happy. I mean, that's the way I read this.
I agree.
If you're a multimillionaire and you build a hospital for little kids, everybody say, well, he's a good person, but you're not pleasing God because you ain't got faith.
Well,
am I right?
No. So that's an important principle, and I'm glad you brought it up because, I've probably preached a dozen lessons out of James chapter 2, right? That faith has to have works. Faith without works is dead. And we talk about good works and the things we need to do and be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. And we talk about works, and works are important. But let's be clear that the things that we do are secondary to the faith that we have. That it's that faith that causes those works. Because those works without faith are just as dead as the faith without the works.
Well, the faith is what makes you want to do the work.
Absolutely. It's the faith that motivates and inspires. So the things that we do, and you mentioned whether we're building a hospital and putting a Christian name on it, or whether we're helping the poor, or whatever we're doing, and that's all well and good, but without faith, those things are just works, and they're not pleasing to God. And I think that's important for us to understand, that the things that we do are secondary to the faith that resides within us. That's a huge point. I'm glad you brought that out.
The Him in verse 6 is God.
Say that again.
The Him in verse 6 is God.
Absolutely.
And without
Yes.
faith it is possible to please Him. It's not pleasing God.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I just wanted to point that out about verse 7. And so Noah, of course, became an heir of righteousness in keeping with faith. Verse 8, to me, this is some of the most beautiful language in all the Bible. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. That's faith, isn't it? By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder, or whose builder and maker is God. I remember a song when I was a kid, and I don't even think it's in our books, because some of the messages of it are probably not great, but it's called The Pearly White City. Anybody remember that song? It says, there's a holy and beautiful city whose builder and maker is God. It sort of takes this and puts it to song. Abraham is one of the most amazing examples of faith that we can. I mean, think about that. Just leaving your home. God comes to you and says, I need you to leave everything that you've ever known, and I need you to go to a place, and I'll tell you how to get there on the way. And you did it. And so did Isaac, and so did Jacob, because they looked to something better. We'll come back to that as we continue the discussion. And by faith, even Sarah, verse 11, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. In verse 12, and so from this one man, I've always thought this was funny, and he as good as dead. You can imagine Abraham reading the scriptures. Man, hey, wait a minute now, as good as dead. It's, of course, talking about his old age. Came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Talk about being rewarded for your faith, that even today we who are Christians are part of the seed of Father Abraham. Verse 13, and all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. So what do you think that verse 13 is a reference to? That they didn't receive the things promised. They saw them and welcomed them from a distance. What's that talking about?
Jesus had arrived.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have talked about that in great detail, but I think that's certainly what this is referencing. That they were all looking to the coming and the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. Absolutely. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. So here he's saying, all right, you've got this great legacy of faith, and now those of you who are part of that and are looking to that same vision, you're part of this lineage. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You know, he says there, if Abraham and all these other people, if they had wanted to go back to where they came from, they had an opportunity to go. It's almost like he's saying, you Hebrews, if you want to go back to apostasy, if you want to go back to Judaism, if you want to leave, there's an opportunity for you to return. But if you do, you're short-sighted and weak-minded and missing the concept of eternity. And by faith, instead they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one, verse 16. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. To me, one of the most inspirational stories in all of the Bible, and one of the most mind-boggling stories. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So to me, this is cool because we get an insight into the thinking of Abraham. We've got the narrative, but this gives us the way of thinking. Once again, this is stuff that we could spend a long, long time talking about. By faith, in verse 20, Isaac, I think it could say here that by faith, Isaac got on a table when his dad was holding a sword, right? But it's not what it's talking about. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. And by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. And by faith, Joseph, so we're continuing down the line here, right? When his end was near, spoke about the exodus, of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses. So we've switched time periods here, right? Up to Joseph, what age are we talking about? What part? We're talking about the patriarchs, right? Here we switch to the second sort of stage or age, whatever you want to call it, of Christianity. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And by faith, Moses, so interestingly, verse 23 is not about Moses, is it? Who's it about? His parents. Anybody remember Moses' parents' name?
Amram and Jochebed.
Oh, there's always a few smarties in the class. Say them again.
Amram and Jochebed.
All right, good job. So if any of you have a daughter coming, Jochebed is still a name that's out there. By faith, verse 24, Moses, when he had grown up, so now it's about Moses, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Now, what jumps out to you in verse 26 is a little bit strange. Just read that to yourself and see what jumps out to you.
The reproach of Christ.
What did Moses know about Jesus?
The promise of it, certainly. He knew the promise.
It's this whole part of why their faith is great. And I think it's a great reference back to what Dennis was saying and with Thomas. These people had faith in Jesus even though they hadn't seen him, but they knew the promise, right? So he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ, or the reproach of Christ, as greater value than all the treasures of Egypt. Interestingly, he regarded the value of something he couldn't see for the value of something that he did see. Oh, we're out of time. Okay. We'll finish this in verse 28. We'll pick up next week. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he who saw him is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And so we'll pick up next week. We got a lot done tonight. We'll pick up in verse 29 next week, and then we'll try to move on into chapter 12. Thank you so much for your participation. Sorry we kept you a little bit long.